Hello and welcome again to the second of our series, kind of looking at the career of Sam Bawlf. Martin Sager and myself, Chris Gower, continue as co-hosts. In the second series, where we get to kind of reflect on our acquaintance with Sam. I first met Sam in 1971 as a student working on the Old Town study of Victoria. Martin, account again how this program.
I first met Sam Bawlf when he was an alderman in the city of Victoria, and he invited me to sit on the Victoria Heritage Advisory Committee, which at that time was just being formed. I had the opportunity to record this interview with Sam at his Salt Spring Island home in May of 2016. This was intended as a contribution to a public symposium titled The Old Town Reunion, a celebration by the original members of the Old Town Study Group. The interview was such a success, I like to think, that it went on longer than originally anticipated. We had the opportunity to have Sam reflect on his eventful career and his thoughts on the urban planning issues which Victoria currently faces. Sadly, we lost Sam a couple of months later after this interview. But this account gives us an opportunity to develop this three-part series, of which this is the second program.
Into the bounty of Sam's presentations in the interview, we've been able to add in imagery that reflect original newspaper clippings from Sam's career, old photographs of his project, and also some video footage of the cityscapes that Sam contributed so much to and was such a concern to him. So we brought that together into the program in total.
In this segment of the interview, Sam provides us with details and anecdotes from some of his pioneering and highly influential urban projects. Over to Sam.
The first building that I took on was the Law Chambers building, as I said, in Bastion Square. And at the time, I was 24 years old, and this was going to make or break me as far as whether I had any future in this business. And I had to learn everything to do with building structures and building code and how to rent or lease premises, and everything all came in that package. Peter Cotton, being the architect, was proved to be very, very crucial to the project, because at the beginning we were just moving things around a little bit, opening up, making connections to the adjacent building, and rationalizing the interior spaces and cleaning the exterior. And we were set to go with some tenants. We planned to open in March of 1969. We had already sent out the invitations to the opening, when one morning the phone rang at 5 o'clock in the morning, and it was the chief of the fire department saying, "Your building is burning." And I thought it was a joke at first, and then it wasn't, and then I got down there. And what had happened was that the carpet layers had come in at the last minute with the last item to be installed, and left them leaning against electric, wall-mounted electric heater, which sucked the plastic wrapping around the carpet in, lit it on fire, and all this was in the fantastic front stairway with all the oak and everything. And the fire got a hold there and went straight up through the roof, all 3 floors, and destroyed this gorgeous old balustrade and everything with it. And fortunately, Peter Cotton, being who he is, dear Peter, had made measured drawings of the balustrade. And we got, the insurance company wanted us to put in aluminum railings instead, to replace this fabulous old staircase. And we refused. I said, we're going to put it back the way it was. And Peter had the drawings, and Moore Whittington, who were fabulous mill workers, made the whole thing, including the entrance doors and everything, the balustrade. We even found the hexagonal tile in the basement of a tile shop in Quebec City. We got the lincrusta, which is the dado, which was pressed paper from England. We did everything, right? And now, you see, so what had become sort of a modest stabilization and retrofitting of a building had become a full-blown restoration project. And took us another 6 or 8 months to complete. And this being my first project, I also got to learn about insurance and fire departments and all sorts of things to do with building restoration, which of course Peter, being the resident genius in Victoria at that time, was a wonderful experience. It also was a building that served to really, I think, wake up a lot of people in terms, as I said earlier, to the fact of these things being feasible without public money, but also the energy that could be brought into one of these things by the innumerable young people that were flooding into the city. And so we had all these interesting shops and a little restaurant. You remember Queequeg?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. And you know, so altogether it was, and I think it proved to be quite a popular little place.
Well, still there, still functioning.
Well, unfortunately, it's now no longer what it was, but it's ready for a new life.
Yeah.
But it's survived.
Yeah.
Now, I think the sad part is that they've taken the museum away from the old courthouse. They've taken the Maritime Museum away, and I have a feeling that they want to turn it into a casino. Yeah. So if that happens, Lord knows. Well, then we went on to the counting house, and I did speak of that earlier. But again, it was Peter working with me, and I think the thing that came out of that one, apart from what I've already described, you know, how we put it together and the film festival and everything, was Peter's habit of staying on top of what was getting demolished around the city.
Yes.
And Peter came down one day and he said, oh, one of the old Dunsmuir houses is being, you know, a McClure is being demolished, and we should get over there, Sam, and see what we can get. So we went over and we got that huge bow front balcony that's in the county house.
Yeah, it was over the interior hall. Yeah.
I don't know, is it still there?
It's still in the county house, yeah.
Yeah, good. And the stair up under the arch was actually the back or servant stair from the Dunsmuir house. And various lamps and bits and pieces. And around this time, it was winter, it was of 71, I think. And we're in our little house on Avalon Road. And there was a woman who I recognized who came by from time to time, came to the door and knocked. It was snowing. And it was Mrs. Worthington. And I said, well, please come in. And we got her tea and we sat down. And she said, Sam, I have a problem and I'm wondering if you would be able to take it over for me. And I said, well, what's that? And she said, well, my husband owned these buildings in Chinatown, and they have a number of elderly Chinese tenants, one of whom just died, and they've put them up in the rafters until the freeze up is over, and then they'll go and bury them. But she said, I can't deal with this anymore. They were each paying $20 a month to live there. And it was the buildings that go through from Fisgard to Herald.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know the ones I'm referring
Yes,
to?
yes.
Yeah. With the alleyway.
Now Dragon Alley, yeah.
Yeah, and what it was each, they were very primitive, cell-like little rooms along this alleyway where each was occupied by a 80-year-old Chinese who'd come out, and he'd worked as or maybe a woodcutter up in the highlands, or worked in the mines, or worked on the railroads or something, and now they'd retired. And this was the same people that I'd seen in legions back in 1962 when I visited my brother there while he was there for the summer. And I mean, there had been thousands on the street in 1962, but by age and the fact they couldn't come in after a certain date, come into Canada, they'd all been trapped in an age group, and they were just dropping like flies. And also the city had actually condemned quite a few buildings around the area. Chinatown was much bigger, included a big chunk of Centennial Square. Mm-hmm. And so I felt sort of attached to this. And I agreed to buy the buildings from her at her price. And the front building on Herald Street became, on Fisgard became a retail store, and then an small artist colony. And the back building on Herald had been a livery
stable, yeah.
Yep, and eventually Tony Hunt put his carving shop in there. But what Peter had taught me, Peter Cotton, was it's worthwhile gathering stuff that's going to be discarded because you can use it in some other place. So all the ground floor of the intervening buildings in that alley, we ended up filling up with doors and window sash and fireplaces and chandeliers and things that we picked up along the way from demolition projects, and we were able to put in and reuse in places like Market Square and retain them. So that place was chock-a-block full. At one point we had 3 saloon bars, each of them 24 feet long, front bar, and then the back bar with the pillars and mirrors, all made in the 1880s or 1890s as catalog items, so that if you were, like one of them came from Butte, Montana, and it had a whole bunch of bullet holes in the front of the bar. And they didn't go for washroom facilities in those days. They put a bra in front of the place and then down through the floor. And we got this thing, and we could have put them all end-to-end because they matched. They were all made by Brunswick, the people who make the pool tables. And they were catalog bars. So if you open up a bar in some cowboy town somewhere, you
just went to the catalog.
Went to the catalog and sent for your bar. And so I think the only one that I know of that survives is in that log building at Whippletree Junction.
Okay.
Okay. And that was Randy Strait who created that out of the remnants of the Duncan Chinatown.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Randy worked for me for a year in a truck with his brother, driving all over North America, looking for store fittings and things. And I would get a call, I'm in Iowa, I've got a whole general store here, all the interior fittings and everything. Do you want it? Yes. Okay. Another one was a drugstore from apothecary from Colorado, built in the 1860s, which became an ice cream parlor in Market Square. And so we went around saving this stuff. And the guy, Randy, was on the road full time. Then, of course, we got the very exciting news that we had the successful bid for the Belmont House, as it was originally called, Belmont Building, originally designed as a hotel, close on the heels of the Empress, but of course just in time for the big property boom to turn into a giant crash. And so the Riley family who built it, the O'Reillys, were left with an empty building from the day they finished it. And it stayed that way pretty much through the Depression, so from the 1912 right through to about 1930 something. It actually 1940 probably, because then the Canadian government took it over as the headquarters for Pacific Command for the war, and occupied it, and after the war sort of backfilled it with government departments. But it was put up for lease, long-term lease, 51 years. And I succeeded in getting that building, and it was important to me, was it completed, as you know, the very important sort of space, defining the space around the harbor. So you had the Empress and the apartment buildings on the other sides, and then the Belmont. And so that alone made it mandatory that we preserve it. And we were able to do that remarkably economically. All the interior partitioning in the building was that hollow clay tile. And we drove a bobcat up the stairs and knocked it all down. It took us 3 or 4 weeks to completely eliminate all the interior partitioning. And we went to an open plan. Now at this point, I didn't have any tenants. We were just going ahead, fixing up the building, and a particular concern was the exterior, and it was at that point that I got Tom Brudenell to do the 2 big oval murals on the back.
Oh, yes, yes.
And Tom did a wonderful job with those. And then we were trying to make sure that all the terracotta all around the building was in good repair. And so I was standing outside one day looking at all this when I got a tap on the back or shoulder, and it was the newly appointed Minister of Human Resources for the province, Norm Levy. And Norm said, I need a place. We've got offices all over the city. We want to put them all in one place. And he said, can we get 3 floors of your building? And I said, of course, Norm. And you have to know that at this time, I mean, as with the other old buildings we'd done, we were able to offer the space for $4 a square foot per year. You know, that's just, I don't know what it is now, $60 or something like that for office space, a square foot. But anyway, we weren't looking to get rich. We just wanted to see the building stabilized and reused, and this was perfect. And so it was arranged that I would talk to the Public Works, which turned out to be George Giles, and then a little time went by, and once again Norm shows up and he says, Sam, we need 3 more floors, because they kind of thought it through how much more they needed. And then a little more time went by, and Norm Pearson, who had been my temporary boss at the Lower Mainland Regional Planning Board, was now in charge of the Environment and Land Use Secretariat, which was administering the Agricultural Land Reserve and all the new environmental regulations that the Barrett government brought in. And they came along and said, we'd like the top floor. And then to keep the place going in terms of keeping that part of the city active and improve it, I thought, well, we've got to do something on the ground floor, and we kept Sidney Reynolds' marvelous old china and shop, one of 3 or 4 stores in Victoria that were not equaled anywhere in the world. And then I put Sam's Deli next to it. And there's a story that goes with Sam's Deli. It became a popular hangout for the guys from the Parliament buildings because, in the old days, prior to the Barrett government, all the Socred ministers went to the Union Club for lunch. But none of the NDP belonged to the Union Club. So, but they could walk slightly less distance and go to Sam's Deli for lunch. And so this was great. You'd see all these people in there. And one day, Dave Barrett, who by then was I was well acquainted with, went up to the counter to order a sandwich, and he said, and I'll have this kind of beer. And he said, could you give me the beer and I'll take it back to the table? And they said, sorry, Mr. Premier, but it's against your liquor laws. We'll have to bring the beer to you. And Dave sort of went off, I don't know why, maybe had a bad day at the office, who knows. And so he decided to open his own deli across the street, kitty corner, in what is now the Tourist Information Center, Barrett's Beanery, which became, unfortunately for Dave, became quite a controversial thing for government spending, right? And so that's how Barrett's Beanery was born, was in Sam's Deli. And the other thing, I guess, that made a big difference, a huge difference, was, of course, opening the old ballroom at the back as Chani's restaurant, named after my son, who was about 2 at the time. But finding Harry de Zwager and Dominique Chapeau to run it. And this was the first restaurant I'd ever owned. I mean, the deli was not really a restaurant, it was a cafe, a sandwich place, but a full-blown restaurant. And we just went by the seat of our pants. And between their energy and the, just the concept, it became, I think, probably one of the most popular restaurants in Greater Victoria for the next quarter century. And there's so many stories that you could tell yourself about the people involved in
Harry,
all of it.
All those,
It was just an extraordinary place. And I think that...
So here's the irony. You don't need to turn it off, but it's just a little interlude because, Harry was a great self-promoter. And remember, he commissioned all these portraits of him, which somehow or other we're going to auction off. I don't know what anyway. So he one of the artists he commissioned from was Jack Wise.
Right.
So Jack Wise showed up the door not with one, but with 2, and they're full size.
Oh yeah.
So they're 6 foot. So of course his widow phoned me up one day. She says, "Oh, I'm moving house." Mary.
Yeah.
I've got all these portraits. I know what to do with them. And particularly the 2 big ones. We've got them just stacked in the basement. They're too big for the house. So I went to look at them, and one is a beautiful one of Harry formally dressed as the maitre d' sort of thing, welcoming people into his restaurant. So I thought, Harry belonged to the Union Club, and he was a big big particularly to smoke cigars, you know, with the boys. And
go
whatnot.
across. Yeah.
So I went to the current manager of the Union Club, showed him a picture of this. I said, one of our former members, we were offered this portrait. We don't have many portraits in the club, but I said, this is a special one. And he looked at me, of course, he came up through the hospitality industry as a chef, you know,
Right,
you know,
yes.
all the things. And of course, he just locked on that picture and he said, we got to have that. We got to have that. And three or 4 weeks ago, yeah, the whole family came, some from the States and Vancouver or wherever, and we had lunch, and they formally turned over the portrait of Harry
Oh, isn't that nice?
in the Mackenzie Lounge, where it is the feature picture.
Oh, man. Harry
So-
would be so proud.
Oh yeah, we would, yeah.
Harry would be so
Yeah,
proud.
and as you say, you know, all the business around it, between
this
Johnny's...
guy, he once decided he was going to try and fix the penal system in the country by inviting a whole bunch of prisoners from the prison to come to lunch with their guards or whatever. And, you know, it's the kind of thing he would do, just seat of the pants, you know, very interesting guy. But, you know, that Chawneys became an institution,
That's right.
I think. And you know, so the Belmont really just hit on all cylinders. It was straightforward. We didn't get rich, we just got it done, you know. And then it left, you know, all these things. I mean, Sam's Deli is still there. Well, you see, at the time, I didn't really have the time to worry about trying to run a sandwich shop. So I found somebody who owned it for many, many years, and I said, "Do you want to buy this?" "Yeah, sure." So I sold it to him for $60,000. He took several million out of it. But you know, that's just the way things are. You create and move on, you know, or you create and stay there, and that's the end of what you've got to contribute. And what got me interested, what got me going was partway through that, finishing up the Belmont. My lawyer said, "Would you be interested in this property over here?" And it was the Market Square. And, you know, half a city block with all these old buildings. And it was ridiculously... I mean, I'm using these numbers from time to time not to impress people at any kind of acumen that I possessed. It was just the fact of what things cost then, and which enabled us to do a lot of these things. The whole of Market Square cost, well, if you add in, we had to buy an additional building, maybe $600,000. About the price of a bungalow now. Right, half a city block, and then we went across the street, bought 3 more buildings for 100 and something, so that we had enough exposure, you know, to really make a statement that would draw people that far away from where they'd been habituating. And we learned from the Sam's Deli and Chawneys experience that one of the key things is to animate the street with restaurants and get that done. Don't worry about the upper floors so much. Worry about getting the buildings preserved and get the street fronts active and animated so people enjoy walking the area. And that, of course, happened at Market Square with several places. But the thing that defined Market Square was an instant, a moment where everything came together. After I had said, yes, we'll go ahead, we bought that property from the Scott and Peden family who owned the feed business down there. Their sign's still up on Store Street from, I don't know, 1880 or something. But after I said yes, we'll do that, I just happened, again, thanks to Peter Cotton's influence, to go and look at what they were doing over in James Bay with the demolition of the old Rithit wharves. Here were the original wharves at the outer edge of the harbor before the Ogden Point docks, were the Rithit wharves. And this is where the ships that plied the waters to the Orient and India and everywhere came, passenger vessels and freight vessels, starting around 1880, I think. And I went and looked, and they were just getting ready to bulldoze everything. And it was Cleveland Wrecking who'd contracted to do this. This was an American company, and their superintendent was a guy named Dick Laws, and Dick turned out to be a super guy. And I said, Dick, look at this place. Look at this timber. The timber was 18 by 18 posts of solid fir without a knot and 40 feet of length. They'd been cut in the Cowichan Valley and dragged out by oxen and brought round and made this. And they made trusses 80 feet long, so there was a span of 80 feet in these sheds. And you can see in the old museum photographs how they used them for storing freight and so on. And then later, during the Second World War, the docks were used as part of the shipbuilding industry, and then fell into disuse, I guess. But anyway, I said, Dick, what would you want for this stuff? Because his plan was to knock it all down with a D8 cat and then grind it up into matchwood and haul it away. His job's demolish the place and get rid of the piers afterwards that they were sitting on. And he said, well, look, you can have all the timber you want out of here for $17,000. I said, holy smokes. I went home that night and I thought about Market Square, and I thought about how we could, because this was the big issue, how was I going to create something that would unify all these buildings and make use of that wonderful big space in the middle of the block. And here it was. For $17,000, I could buy all the heavy timber I needed and even showcase some of these extraordinary big trusses. And so Peter Cotton-like, I went down the next day and said, you got a deal. And then just again, sort of an ironic bit, when in all my travels with Peter Cotton, we'd invariably run into, whenever we went to a demolition site, Butch Taylor. And Butch and his dad were the demolition people of Victoria. They did every wonderful old building we know of, not out of malice, but because they had the contract. And I said, so I got a hold of Butch and I said, Butch, can you get this timber out of here intact? And he said, oh yes. He said, he built a special steel dolly to carry these 80-foot long trusses, each of them weighing 3 tons. And he could carry 3 at a time, but at night, because we had to go along and lift the wires all the way along and down to Bastion Square, and then the crane would pick them up and lift them off. And we broke up most of them to use for the timber walkways, but we saved some of the trusses for the shed, which has recently been
finally
removed. And frankly, I think for the better. I mean, when we built Market Square, we had a big shed, as most people know, to complete the quadrangle around the square, but the concept was a public market down there that never got going. And I think this is an example where there's room to evolve in in the old town and work new solutions in and around the old. And so the removal of the shed, in my view, was a positive thing. It opened it up. And lest anyone think I feel badly about it, I don't. But what a wonderful opportunity to pull it all together. It just defined the whole thing about Market Square. That was the end of my restoration work with the original company that I created. The following year, 1975, I was elected to the provincial legislature, and shortly after that, put in cabinet, and having well over 100 tenants in all these buildings, and only myself and one assistant to look after them. But more important, having a whole building, I think 8 floors full of government offices, it seemed clear that I couldn't be a minister in the government and have them as tenants in my own buildings. So we sold the company with all those buildings in it. And that was the end of that chapter of my life. And then we got into, I had the opportunity, as we've discussed, of creating a province-wide heritage program modeled on a lot of the things we learned in Victoria at City Council and other initiatives. And one of the, but I did manage to keep my hand in a little bit, because we took on, I'd started campaigning to preserve the Crystal Garden when I was on City Council. And what had happened was that the building had been built on what we would call a raft foundation, a 3-foot thick slab of concrete, which sat on top of a former garbage dump. And of course, as one might expect with a garbage dump, there'd been some settlement and shifting and so on. And then that slab, it had the weight of a swimming pool on top. And so the slab had split in half, midway. And there were various schemes and calculations that, oh, this would be okay if we could put it back as a pool. And this was at a time when there was the plans for the pool up, the new Crystal Pool. The pool idea didn't go over. I sat down with the city engineer and we calculated that it would have, the whole building would have an overturn moment in an earthquake. It would just be like a giant ship just slowly turning topsy-turvy because of the amount of water. And my thinking had been, why not take, pardon the pun, take the cue from Kew Gardens? This is the type of structure that suited garden, and it would be a nice sort of oasis to have a year-round kind of tropical garden there in a Victorian, almost a Victorian or a late Edwardian context. And so while I was minister, I spent some days, some evenings, pottering away with, I got the drawings for the building and laid out the garden as I foresaw it, and went to cabinet and I said, we really don't want to be associated with the destruction of this building. Let's do this. It's $2 million, and the cabinet approved it, and it became part of that 1978 package, which was Victoria hosting the Captain Cook Bicentennial. But I think perhaps the most interesting part of it was we had a year there when I got the approval for the Captain Cook Bicentennial celebration in May of 1977, and the celebration was going to start in May of 1978. And we had to bring tall ships from all over the world, naval ships. We had this huge moving regatta, we had events, fireworks, things all over the place, all over the coast to plan, and we hadn't even talked to anybody yet. And Admiral Mike Martin played a very valuable role in that, as did Grace McCarthy, and we managed to scrabble together all these tall ships and so on. But the harbor of Victoria was handicapped to some extent in terms of its ability to host this. One of the biggest challenges was the old Black Ball ferry terminal, which was on Wharf Street near Government, and the overflow traffic would line up along Wharf Street, and it had been an obnoxious situation for the city for years. And I got a hold of the Mrs. Atchison, whose husband had founded Black Ball Ferries, came up from Seattle. She was in her 80s. And I said, Mrs. Atchison, we want to move your ferry across the harbor to a new terminal over here. Your manager believes it will actually be a great improvement for the company. We will absorb the cost of fixing the docks if you'll put up your own terminal building. And we did the whole thing on a handshake, right then and there. And then I had the job of ripping out the old CPR finger pier where the steamships used to dock. I've seen all the old historic photos of rows of steamships there. And that was quite interesting because they had to dredge afterwards. And when they dredged, they got all this CPR china and silverware and everything off the bottom. But that then opened up the opportunity to put a new pier, a public pier, on the other side of the harbor, opposite the apartment buildings, where the Black Ball had been. And it was simply a matter of refacing the Black Ball pier and then adding a finger. And I think we did the whole thing for $800,000. And it became kind of the host pier for Victoria for maritime events, including right up to the visit of the Queen in her yacht before it was decommissioned.
The Brit being tied up there.
And all kinds of fascinating, lots of sailing ships and so on. And it became like almost the weekly, let's go down and wander. And I felt it was a major benefit to the harbor. And then we also were able to get some money, federal money, and build the 90-boat marina further down. But the amazing thing is all that got done in 8 months. And if you look at the harbor today, you'll realize there's been almost no change. Those things done in 8 months define the harbor as it stands today.
Yeah.
And we just fast-tracked it.
And I mean, the legacy of the tall ships and became, the Wooden Boat Festival, the classic boats, which is this coming weekend, right? So.
But it was on my desk at home. I had a drawing table like that, and I drew the thing out how we would do the facing detail, and Spilsbury did the pile driving, and it was fun.
Well, there we go. Thanks again, Sam. You've kind of made your own history, and it's been a real kind of review of a big section of Victoria's history as well. And we turn again to our specialist panel, who all knew Sam. We'd like them to dig in to Sam's contributions to history. John Adams, historian appropriately. Pamela Madoff, city councillor and longtime acquaintance of Sam's. And Jean Miller, longtime Victoria gadfly. Martin Sager as well. And Martin will lead off with a question to the panel.
So we've seen that Sam's projects were not only distinctive, they were innovative and pioneering. And they looked forward to an evolving scope and quality as he moved his work through the city. They played a significant role in Victoria's development and also in the development of what we might call the urban community, those who thought about these things, planned them, and of course the politics that ran behind it all. So I want to ask our panel members to reflect a bit on these projects became markers, and if so, what did they plant in our community's path, and what lessons do they continue to deliver even to the present time? So I'll ask Jean to comment on this.
As you listen to Sam talk and recollect, and you begin to accumulate a sense of the scope of the work he undertook, and you think about what an accident, a lucky accident it was that Sam was in Victoria to undertake that work, and then at least to speculate what would have happened if there was no Sam Bawlf. He was the agent of so much change in architectural preservation and the re-enlivening of portions of downtown. And I think to myself, had there not been a Sam, it might have happened to some degree, but I don't think it would have happened on the scale that it did happen. And that's particularly puzzling. I know it was happening in cities all over North America. People had moved out of downtown. Their attention wasn't on downtown, particularly the old towns. But somehow you wouldn't think that would be true of Victoria, but it was.
John, you remember city in those days, and you commented on its derelict state. It's hard to reconstruct that from our present perspective in a vibrant city that Victoria is. But, take us through a little bit, and as a historian, how does that fit together or make a mark?
Well, the Victoria of the early 1960s that I remember when I first moved here was very different. First of all, it was a very dirty industrial city all around the harbor, smokestacks, sawmills. It was a very gritty place. And the part of town we call Old Town, basically everything west of Douglas Street, was to a large extent derelict, especially the area around what is now Bastion Square, Johnson Street, Market Square, and Chinatown. Yeah. Those buildings were either boarded up, half empty, or were on the verge, in some cases, of falling apart. And some of them had already come down. And it's really difficult to imagine. Today, Victoria is so vibrant because people like Sam Bawlf did come along at the right time, and those buildings could easily have come down or been totally transformed in very bad ways. And I think the sort of work that Sam did was visionary in a way. There were other people coming up with ideas, Rod Clack, the planning department, but that was also very much visionary, not new to Victoria. It was being done in other places too. But it was a gamble. And when Sam, as a developer, got involved in places like the Law Chambers and Bastion Square, but I think probably most importantly Market Square, it was a huge gamble. And although he admitted later, and in a rather embarrassed way, that he was really quite embarrassed at how little he paid for the buildings that made up Market Square, 8 buildings ready to fall down, nobody else had to do that. And in a way, it was an oasis in the middle of a derelict area, and remained so for a long time, because he did it in the mid-1970s. but that area didn't really perk up around it for another decade or so, and in some cases it's still ongoing. And Sam saw the potential, and his brother Nick, an architect, was able to put it together with Sam, but nobody else was thinking about that at the time in that area. And I think it's difficult to imagine now when you walk up Johnson Street and see all those boutiques and aromatherapy shops and places that were simply not there. All that has sprung from the vision that Sam was able to deliver to that area.
So, Councillor Madoff, I have dim memories of you inserting yourself into the body politic of Victoria. Maybe that's the in a critical
That's quite an image.
At a critical moment with the Eaton's what was then called the Cadillac Fairview development, Eaton Centre complex, which was the project of downtown was ongoing, but it was a critical moment. I wonder, reflecting on that, there's a story or a lesson.
Well, I think for those of us who lived through it and experienced the Cadillac Fairview debate, we often referred to it afterwards as before and after the flood, almost in biblical terms, because the city did change dramatically after the decision was made to develop the Eaton Centre. The political landscape changed, the community landscape changed in terms of community activism as well. And we learned some very painful lessons as a result of the Eaton Centre, which really propelled us forward for many years in terms of the general public having a real understanding and appreciation for the stewardship of Old Town. And I think now it's enough time has passed that perhaps people take it for granted. They don't realize the battles that it took and the efforts that it took to actually have Old Town being what it is today. And the decisions that we make have such an incredible impact on that. And what I've said often to my council is that all we have to do is to be the stewards of the incredible visionary policies and planning principles that were put in place decades ago. And when I look back to the work that Sam did, and I look at the buildings that he did, they were not only architectural markers, they were actually cultural markers. You know, growing up in Victoria as a youngster and a teen, I was given free rein. I was downtown by myself all the time. The only proviso from my parents was, you know, don't go west of Government Street, which is the only place I wanted to be, which was Old Town. But the only thing there in those days for me to go to was the Goodwill thrift shop, Sally Ann thrift shop, a few other junk stores and that kind of thing. When it started to change, and it was really Sam's projects with Market Square and in particular the law chambers, it wasn't only that those buildings were given new life and rehabilitated using very high standards in terms of architectural restoration, but one of the things that was really important to Sam was how they were inhabited. And he was very conscious of the kind of businesses that went into those buildings. So as a teenager, it wasn't just the architecture that attracted us, but they were the really hip places to be, whether they were the restaurants or the shops. And he was very conscious of that, and he gave people a break in order to get them into the buildings and to create those kinds of businesses. And when we spoke about these kinds of things in the period just before his death, he just kept emphasizing to me how important it is to have youth involved and having an interest in Old Town and the projects. And a lot of that has to do with the nature of the businesses, who wants to be there. And what we're finding in Old Town now, at least in part, around Bastion Square, many people might not realize there's more than 60 gaming studios. They don't present much of a public face, but they're there, and it's young, dynamic people, and they want to live there and they want to work there. And so the buildings are the framework that allows for that evolving change of use, but it's the buildings themselves that attract that use.
Yeah, it's a good point too, and sometimes we see the city from its urban front, or, you know, if you enter the city, you come off the ferries, you come in through Blanchard Street or come down Island Douglas Street. But Sam had an interest in seeing it from another point of view, which was the harbour. And Chris, you've done a lot of work in and around the harbour planning-wise since, not just one of your first early interests in the old Blackwall Ferry building and its site.
Yeah.
How about
that
turning us around a bit?
That was actually one of my most kind of vital recollections of Sam were his presentations on the harbor itself and his interest in reanimating, reactivating the harbor. He talks about moving the Bawlf ferry terminal. The Lower Causeway had just been completed in the 70s. I mentioned earlier, it was kind of an idea that came up in the Centennial era by planners and architects back in the 50s. And the idea of making the harbor much more people-oriented and cultural and formalizing it really built on the original kind of causeway and added an urban design feature to it. And Sam, I think, kind of was stepping ahead from that too with his ideas in the harbor. I've always been interested in that. I did my thesis on urban waterfronts. And I think this is a topic that's still with us. The Old Town study posited that the harbor front of Victoria would have a small scale, no high rises, intensive public activity, pedestrian activity. It was not to be a dormant kind of neutrally landscaped area. There was supposed to be activity and back and forth. Commercial vitality, it looked to the origins of the city. I think these were all in Sam's mind. I know that Sam did sketches for the conference center proposal on the Inner Harbor. He was involved in the Victoria Regent, which was actually part of the conference center kind of thesis for the harbor. The Regent Center may be overreached. My thought about that is that it could have been way worse. It could have been another Reed Center. But the interest in the vitality of the harbor and the urban form of Victoria and the historical integrity of Victoria were all, they were all key, kind of principles for Sam. And I think they kind of remain with us. And for me, I think those things are all significant.
Jean, your intersection with the city during that period was very much as an animator of the arts. And it's a kind of almost a trope in urban design that, if you've got a rundown area, throw a bunch of artists in there. Artist studios, performing art spaces, and that kind of brings it. Was that in your mind behind open space, or was it just a cheap building at on a street that you could park?
Let me see how much of that I can remember. I was introduced to a man named Jeff Sheffield, who owned 510 Fort Street, which way back then, at roughly 1970-71, was an almost disused warehouse. It had two large doors. I think some moving and storage company had operated there. One thing led to the next. Jeff was prepared to rent the building to me. We settled on a price, which I think I was able to pay for at least the first 3 months. Then he forgave the rent, and open space operated rent-free. And listening to our conversation about Sam reminds me how much timing has to do with all of this. And you had asked me earlier, Chris, to maybe talk about memory, and listening to the comments and the recollections about Sam, I find myself thinking that to some extent he was an agent of memory at a time, and cities probably go through this in cycles, where the city had forgotten. And part of that is economic, part of it is social. John, it was interesting to listen to your recollections about how the whole area west of Government Street was derelict, or a variety of marginal industrial and industrial businesses were operating or on their last legs there. And somehow Sam was the right guy at the right time, with the right ideas to essentially resurrect and redefine memory for Victoria. and brought enormous influence and brought the city back in mind of itself. I'll search for a better way to say that as we continue our conversation, but that's my key memory. The arts and the culture thing, I think I brought those values from New York. I was interested in creating some kind of a center for arts and culture, not simply as arts, but very much as sort of cultural and small p political expression, which when open space was functioning in those ways, I was never happier. When I was holding public meetings or rallies or small p political events, those were the die happy moments for me. The culture also gave me pleasure, obviously. The times allowed it for me in my ways, for Sam in his.
And I think, Gene's talking about the importance of timing, and timing is so critical, but it's the right people at the time. And when I started to reconstruct that timeline, and Sam's brother Nick had done his graduating thesis in 1963 on the potential to create Bastion Square when it was just basically a parking lot.
Yes.
And then to see, roll the clock forward, Sam comes over to visit Nick, gets involved in Victoria, and the law chambers in Bastion Square becomes one of the most dynamic spaces.
That's how it happened?
That's exactly how it happened. Right people, right time.
Wow.
And when you look back, how grateful we should be for right people, right time, because often we focus on wrong people, wrong timing in terms of urban development.
And Sam and Nick did come along at the right time, because what was being proposed for the area just west of Bastion Square along Lower Wharf Street, but the Reed Center, enormous towers, some of them actually built in the water.
Right.
That were going to be built on vacant land, or what had become vacant land, but also they would overshadow all of that area around Bastion Square and would even involve the demolition of other buildings. And that was being opposed by a number of people, but Sam was also just getting right in there, and I guess as a developer he could have proposed something like that. But instead, he was keeping to the scale of the buildings. He was not adding stories. He was changing buildings inside, but even there, he was doing what might be considered restoration work, as opposed to something that was totally out of place.
Right.
Do any of you have the memory to talk about why Sam made the choice, in your mind, why he made the choice to preserve and re-enliven as opposed to knock down or redevelop?
I think Sam was highly insightful. He saw an economic shortcut. He realized you didn't have to start from scratch. You could bring renewed value out of a resource, and I think that was very wise. I think it worked at the scale of economics he was working on, but it paid back, and he proved that, I think, in his projects. And not many other people had taken a trial of that. He was quite courageous, I think, and it also ties to his respect for history, the city.
Sam was very interested in history, and I think it just is reflected in his last big project that took the last couple of decades of his life, Sir Francis Drake. Historical research, almost pure historical research, not involved in heritage building restoration. But he was really a historian. Well, he was probably an architect deep down. He wanted to be an architect, but I think he truly was also a historian. And so when he saw an old building, I suspect his first interest was in seeing that building remaining and being preserved, as opposed to being totally altered.
Well, I think too it's a combination of aesthetics and economics, because Sam's interest was every home that he owned was a heritage home. He grew up in a heritage home in Vancouver. I think it was just sort of part of the DNA, really, of what his aesthetic interest was. And when he came here, I think he also saw an incredible opportunity, because as John was saying, and it's hard to believe now what the state was in Old Town not that many decades ago.
Yeah, I thi-
Sorry, but I just wonder whether being a historian or Sam's interest in history expresses an interest in continuity or communicates an interest in continuity. And maybe a discomfort with discontinuous social activity or social events, historical events.
I think he did really try to marry the present with the past, and whether it was a building project or his research about Sir Francis Drake, I think he saw his research about Sir Francis Drake was not just because he was interested in Drake. He really saw that being applied to the present time, and in his mind it was involved very much in land claims and things of that sort. So it wasn't just an isolated historical activity, it was something that did have resonance in the present as well.
The interesting part of this, and what I think made Sam different from heritage enthusiasts of the day, was that he was looking for a entrepreneurial private sector solution to issues such as the conservation of townscapes, cityscapes, buildings, memory itself. And this was not common at the moment. The standard held up, or the constant reference, was the British model, post-war, massive public investments in infrastructure as a result of the destruction of the Second World War throughout Europe. This was not the case in Canada. We just had economic dereliction. And he looked upon all his projects, I think, as kind of private sector, but for the public experiments that we could learn from. And when later during his years on cabinet, when he set up the British Columbia Heritage Trust, he put people around the table of that trust board who he thought could take this message, the message of experience of downtown Victoria in particular, Gastown, same degree, out throughout the province. And in the case of the trust, there would be small investments, but in fact, the original idea behind the trust was it would actually make loans, and they would be repayable, and there would be a kind of a bottom line to everything. And ultimately, there was a bottom line, and of course, it comes through economic rejuvenation, and which worked. I mean, it just has worked in places as varied as Nelson, British Columbia, and Revelstoke, places anywhere where you can look for history, and sometimes it's not even urban centers or downtown centers. To a large degree, it was reinvention, in fact, of British Columbia's historic sites, creation of markers and marking programs, interpretive programs, and as you say, the right people at the right time. He brought in around him a group of young architects, planners, historians, archaeologists, and this burgeoning of interest and enthusiasm around taking whole new techniques, not just to the conservation and restoration of buildings, but to interpretation of landscape and directing that at various forms of economic revitalization. And that, I think, is the lesson which carries into current times.
And if maybe just briefly return to Jean's question about memory, Sam was very interested in community memory, and I remember he once told me a story that really had an impact on me about Chinatown, and he was asked to go and look at a building, the Lim building, the 1800 block of Government Street between Herald and Chatham, and he was asked perhaps to take an interest in the building, to buy it, and as he looked around, he found rooms that were abandoned, rooms that elderly Chinese men had lived in, but as they died off, their colleagues would just wrap up their possessions in a bedroll, old photographs, phonograph records, books, and all that sort of stuff. And they were simply rolled up. And Sam was told he could take whatever he wanted. But he explained to me that although he was tempted to, he wasn't going to do that because these were memory bundles. And he thought whatever happened to the building, those memory bundles should stay in the building. And in the end, I have no idea what happened to those items. But his idea of community memory, I think, was very strong, as that illustrates.
Well, folks, we're running out of time as the conversation just gets interesting. So I'd like to thank you all for these rather fascinating insights and indeed memories of, the long road to the conservation of Old Town Victoria. So thank you again, and we look forward now to our third program, in which Sam will address the Old Town reunion meeting, and was the original reason why I went over for the interview. So we look forward to that. Thank you all.
Welcome.